Hi and welcome to the Sew Essential vlog. I'm Lucy and I'm here today to talk you through reading and understanding a sewing pattern. So you've decided you'd like to have a go at making your own clothes, but some of the terminology and some of those diagrams just look totally overwhelming. Well, I'm here today to help talk you through so that you understand what the important bits are to focus on, and just it will make life a bit easier. We stock a huge range of sewing patterns on our website, and you'll find links to our website and our blog below. And you'll also find a huge range of beautiful dressmaking fabrics and all the haberdashery and notions you need to make your next sewing project up with. So get on and have a look there. If you are new to sewing as well, please like and subscribe to our channel, because every week I bring you a video with either a tutorial or some sewing inspiration and ideas that will help you along your sewing journey. So let's get started with reading and understanding a sewing pattern. I think the first thing that's really important to say is choosing the right pattern is a good place to start. So you might have been dreaming about making a huge ball gown that would make all your princess dreams come true, but realistically it's not a good idea to choose something too complicated to get started with. Think about simple things like a simple top or skirt or dress, or perhaps some pyjama bottoms. Trousers generally are a bit more difficult to fit than some of the other garments I mentioned, but a loose fitting pair of pyjama bottoms with a drawstring waist or elasticated waist, they would be a good place to start. So just think something nice and simple. So for a beginner, we're looking for something nice and simple, minimal fuss. So here's some good examples. So we've got this new look pattern here, which is a very, very simple t-shirt design. There's even a version without any sleeves, so even more simple. You can see there's not much design features or fuss on there. And there's also this little sign, 1 hour sewing time, easy. And you'll often find there'll be an easy or beginner sort of reference on the pattern packet. Some of the indie patterns like this True Bias one will have a difficulty rating on them, so you can see that that's nice and easy. And then this Friday Pattern Company pattern has got easy written on it as well, so they can be a bit of a help and a bit of an indication that these patterns are meant to be a bit easier. On the commercial patterns as well, you can refer to the line drawings on the back of the pattern, and you'll get those often on the indie patterns as well. And you can just see there again that there isn't a lot of fuss and detail going on there. Also, the number of pattern pieces is sometimes listed, which can give you an idea. Now, this one says 17 pieces, which is a lot, but actually there's 3 views. So each one of these views probably only requires 5 or 6 pattern pieces, and you can just use the line drawings to get an idea. It doesn't give you all the information, but it will give you some idea as to whether that looks like a relatively simple thing to make. And then the only other thing I would say as well is just consider how the pattern is going to be fastened, or if indeed there are any fastenings, because the 2 patterns here, the Friday Pattern Company and the True Bias pattern, there aren't actually any fastenings on those. There's no buttons or zips or anything, so that's nice and easy to make. On the new look pattern, you just need 1 button to fasten it, so that's much easier than doing lots and lots of buttonholes, for example. And I would say that using a zip is easier for a beginner than doing lots of buttonholes and buttons as well. So they're just some basic considerations. I have also put together a video of my top 5 beginner sewing patterns, so I'll put a link to that below. And I think it's also worth mentioning here, you'll spot 2 main types of sewing pattern. There's the commercial patterns, which are produced on a large scale, and they include the brands McCall, Simplicity, Butterick, Burda, New Look and Vogue. And then there's the independent pattern brands, or indie patterns you might hear them referred to as, and these tend to be produced on a much smaller scale. There's less designs, and they're just generally a smaller company. Often it's 1 or 2 people running the business. And my favourite brands are Closet Core Patterns, True Bias, Grainline Studios. There's a few others that I really like to make. Now, the main difference is that the independent patterns, a lot of beginners tend to lean towards those because their instruction booklets tend to be a bit more elaborate in terms of the amount of detail that you get. Some of them will even have beautiful colour photos through the step-by-step instructions that are provided. And they also often do a sew along online as well, so you can watch the blog posts week after week as they're making the garments, and that can be really helpful. Having said that, I learned predominantly with commercial patterns, and I'm really passionate about the fact that I like working with both, and I think it really broadens your horizons if you're able to work with both. So the commercial patterns, although the instructions aren't as extensive as the independent patterns, there's a much bigger choice of designs, like literally thousands of designs to choose from. And once you know the basic sewing terminology, and once you know the stuff I'm going to go through today, actually, as long as you've chosen a relatively simple design, there's no reason why a beginner can't use a commercial pattern. And they're actually putting a lot of effort in now to, I think, making them a bit easier to understand for people as well, especially beginners. Once you've chosen the sewing pattern you'd like to make, you need to choose your size, and it's really important here not to just pick the size that you are in ready to wear clothes, because quite often you'll be a very different size in a sewing pattern, because the sizing systems on sewing patterns have no correlation to what you would buy from the shops. So please don't assume that if you're a size 14 in the shops that you'll be a size 14 in a sewing pattern. Very often that's not the case, and very often you might be a size or two bigger in a sewing pattern, and that's because a lot of the time the sizing systems used for a lot of the sewing patterns were set about sort of decades ago, when people generally were a lot smaller. But this is where sewing comes into its own. You know, we don't have to try and fit ourselves into the standard size. We can make the clothes to fit our bodies and celebrate that. So, you know, let's not get hung up on sizes here. Let's celebrate the fact that you can make it to fit you. So for most sewing patterns, you're going to need to take 3 measurements, which are your bust, your waist and your hips. Once you've taken those measurements, you need to refer to the pattern packet to choose your size. So once you've taken your body measurements, we're going to look at the pattern packet for the information we need to choose the relevant size. So you can see here that there's a chart for imperial measurements in inches, and there's also one for metric measurements in centimetres, and that's the case on most sewing patterns. I measure myself in inches, which is perhaps a little bit old-fashioned in the UK these days, but it's just the way I was taught, so I'm going to use this table to demonstrate, but both the tables work in exactly the same way. So you'll notice along the top the sizes are listed in the top row, and then you've got a row for the bust, waist and hip measurements. You've also got a back neck to waist row as well, but most people won't need to use that. That's more important if you're particularly tall or if you're very petite. If you're sort of an average, more of an average height, it's these measurements that you want to concentrate on, the bust, waist and hips. So I'm going to look at the bust, and I know that I'm a size 34-inch bust, so that is a size 12. At the waist I'm a 28, so that's a 14, and at the hips I'm a 38, so that's a 14. So I'm actually straddling 2 sizes here. I'm a 12 at the bust and a 14 at the waist and the hips. But what I can do, because the patterns are multi-sized and all the different sizes are on one tissue, I can actually cut a 12 at the bust, and then I can taper or grade the lines out to a 14 at the waist and hips, and you can just draw that onto the pattern paper before you cut it out. Just make sure it's a nice smooth gradual line, and then obviously you need to make sure the front and the back pattern pieces match up as well. You might be lucky though, and you might find that you sit perfectly within one of the sizes, or you might find that you almost sit within one of the sizes and you think, well, that will probably be okay. But what I would say is it's always a good idea just to make up a toile, which is using a cheap fabric to make a practice garment, just to test the fit before you start sewing with your real fabric. Next, the really exciting bit, choosing the fabric and the notions you're going to use to make your sewing pattern up. So I will talk about the information on the pattern packet, but first I always think it's a good idea to just think generally about fabrics and think about the design and the garment that you're wanting to make. and what type of fabric you might need for that. Does it need to be something that flows and drapes and moves, or does it need to be something more structured? And you can find lots of clues in your wardrobe as well for that, as well as just by looking at the image on the pattern packet if there is one. Now, I did film a video on how to choose the right dressmaking fabric for your project as well, and I'll pop a link to that below. But let's have a look at the packet information. So if you refer to the back of the pattern packet, you will find a list of suggested fabrics, and this is quite an exhaustive list on this pattern, so lots and lots of ideas and suggestions there. Some of the patterns, like this True Bias pattern, might have a shorter list of fabrics, but it really is just a guide of the types of fabrics you want to be using for this pattern. As a beginner, I'd recommend try and stick to the suggestions, but as you become more experienced, you'll become more confident and you might know similar fabrics with similar properties and decide to use one of those instead. To decide how much fabric you need, you're going to go back to your size charts. Now, I measure myself in imperial measurements, so I measure myself in inches, but then I usually have to come across and refer to the metric table when I want to choose my fabric, because fabric in the UK is often sold by the metre, and you'll also often find the widths of the fabrics are in centimetres as well. So if I want to choose how much fabric I need to make this pattern, if you remember, I was a 12 at the bust and a 14 at the hips and waist. So I'm going to use the size 14 to choose how much fabric I need, because I need to make sure that I've got plenty and I'm not short at all. If I wanted to make view A, you can see here that there's two different lines. There's one for fabric that's 115 centimetres wide and one for fabric that's 150 centimetres wide. This one's going to be your most common, the 150 centimetres wide. Most dressmaking fabrics will be that sort of width. So we'll use that as an example. So if I just come across there to the size 14, I can see that I'm going to need a metre of fabric to make that top. Now, there will also be sometimes suggestions about buying extra if you're using plaid or check and you need to do pattern matching or stripes, for example. But as a beginner, I'd just recommend choose fabrics that don't need pattern matching. Choose a busy print or a plain fabric, because that's just a whole other thing to get into, and it's just nice to keep things simple at the start. You'll also see whether there's any requirements for interfacing for the pattern, which is something that you can iron on or sew onto the fabric just to give it more stability in certain areas. We sell a wide range on our website that you can find, and then it will also tell you the requirements or the notions that you might need, so buttons, zips, that sort of thing. And again, you'll find all the haberdashery, all the fabrics, everything that you need on our website. You can just have a look at the links below and get on and find anything you need for your patterns. Now it's time to have a look inside the packet. So inside the packet you'll find the instruction booklet and the sewing pattern pieces. So let's talk about the instruction booklet first. Now there's lots of new terminology there. It can seem a little bit overwhelming. Some of the diagrams can look a bit complicated, but honestly it's really straightforward once you know what you need to look for. So if we have a little look inside the instruction booklet, these will vary greatly. Some of them will be really snazzy and have beautiful colour photos. Others will be a lot more rough and ready, like this new look one. But don't let that put you off, because as long as you understand what it's telling you, these are easy to use as well. So the first thing that you'll notice is you'll get a list of all the pattern pieces that should be included with your pattern, and then you can see them here as well. And then it lists the little letters at the end of these correspond to the views. So these are the pattern pieces you'll need to make view A, they're the ones for view B, they're the ones for C, and that one's required for C and D. Those ones are required for D. So what a useful thing can be to do as a beginner is just to circle the ones that you're going to use. So I've circled the ones for view A there. So when I'm cutting them out and I'm checking that I've done everything right, I know that I need those 4 pattern pieces, and that can just be helpful when you're starting to navigate your way around these things. You'll also find some sewing directions or a glossary, and these will just list some of the most common techniques that you'll need to use in this sewing pattern. So it's useful to have that to refer back to. You haven't got to memorise it all. As you're sewing away, if you don't know what something means, you can just refer back to the glossary and it will explain it for you. But also, just remember, if you feel like there isn't enough information there or you don't quite understand what it means, you can use a YouTube video tutorial or blog post. There's plenty of them on the internet. We've done lots and lots for different sewing techniques, and you can refer to those to just bolster that knowledge and help you a little bit more. There's also a key here by the glossary showing you what denotes the right side of the fabric and what denotes the wrong side of the fabric on the sewing pattern instructions. So you can see the right side is denoted by the shaded grey colour and the wrong side is denoted by the clear background. And then there's also one for lining and interfacing as well, and that just helps you to understand what's going on in the diagrams in the instruction booklet later. So I always have to refer back to these. Even after years of sewing, I still have to keep referring back to the key. But we said that the shaded one was the right side of the fabric, so you can see they're showing us in that view the right side of the fabric, and here they're showing us the wrong side of the fabric, but you can see where the pieces of fabric have been sewn together there. You can see a little bit of the right side of the fabric poking out, and that is your seam allowance there. That's just the little bit of excess fabric either side of where you've sewn those two pieces of fabric together. So it just helps you to understand what's going on in those diagrams using that key. And then there's also suggested cutting layouts for the fabric here. So this is showing you, based on what width of fabric you've got, how you might want to lay those pattern pieces out to cut them out. Now, I don't really use this. I often find that there's ways of doing it that are a bit more efficient than what's suggested in the pattern instructions. But there's nothing wrong with using these, and it's a good starting point. But if you want to vary it a little bit and you think you know a better way of cutting it out, that's fine. You know, you don't have to stick to these rigidly. They are just there as a guide. And as long as you follow the instructions on the pattern pieces, which we'll talk about more in a minute, then it's not a problem. So we'll talk about that more in detail in a minute. But finally, after you've looked at this information here, if I flip that over, you'll see that the sewing instructions start then, and these are numbered, and it's just step-by-step sewing instructions of how to construct the garment with some handy diagrams as well. So let's have a look now at the actual sewing pattern pieces, and again, these can look incredibly daunting and overwhelming as a beginner, but I'm going to help you pick out the most important information to look for now so that you can feel confident and get started on your sewing journey. So let's have a look at some pattern pieces. The first bit of vital information you're looking for is how to cut the pattern piece out of your fabric. Here I've got an example of a piece that needs to be cut on the fold, and in fact two need to be cut on the fold. You'll also notice these arrows here pointing to the edge of the pattern piece, and that says centre fold. When we dressmake, we fold the fabric right sides together and we line up the finished edges or the selvage, and these pieces that need to be cut on the fold, that edge of the pattern piece needs to be positioned along the fold. However, you'll also get pattern pieces like this sleeve piece, which have cut 2 or potentially 3 or 4 depending on what the pattern piece is. And in these instances, the piece doesn't need to be positioned on the fold, but what you do need to do is ensure that this line here, which indicates where the straight of grain of the fabric should run, you need to ensure that that line runs perfectly parallel to the finished edges of your fabric. So you can just take a tape measure as you pin it and just make sure that this line is the same distance away from the finished edge of the fabric. You can also see on this pattern piece what I was talking about earlier, that most patterns these days are multi-sized. So you can see there's actually 4 different sizes on this piece that I've cut out here. If you need to grade between sizes, like I was talking about earlier, you would simply draw a line between, if I wanted to grade between a 12 and a 10, I would just draw a gradual line to grade between them. So it just needs to be a very gentle gradual line like so, which you might want to do between the bust and the waist, for example, or the waist and the hips perhaps. You'll also notice on the pattern pieces little triangles or sometimes little knot lines at the edges of the pattern pieces, and you might see 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 or 4 of them. These are called notches, and these are there to help us work out how to put the pieces of fabric together once we've removed the pattern tissue. So you can either mark these by just putting a little snip in your fabric. Some people like to cut a little triangle out of the fabric that way so that you're not weakening those seams, because you can, you know, if you're cutting into your seam allowance, you could be weakening those seams. Personally, I do just snip there because I don't worry about that. I think sometimes people worry that they might need to alter the size at a later date, but I tend to just snip there. Or you could cut out little triangles like so, and that just helps you work out how to position the pieces of fabric together, as I mentioned earlier. You'll also find markings for bust darts and design features like that. So if I just show you this pattern piece here, you can see that there's bust dart markings there. So for whichever size you're cutting out, you would need to make a mark on your fabric of both the dart legs, which would be, if I was choosing this size, it would be that point there and that point there, and then the point here at the end of the dart, which is the dart point. Now you can do that by using tailor's tacks, which are just a little cross stitch on the fabric to indicate where those markings are, or you could use tailor's chalk or a marking pen. You just need to think about your fabric and whether a marker pen is suitable or tailor's chalk is suitable. You might not want to run the risk of marking your fabric, and you might decide to use a tailor's tack instead. You'll also find finished garment sizes often on the pattern pieces, and that's really useful because that gives you an idea of how the garment's going to fit when you're finished. So if I'm a 34-inch bust and I'm making a size 12, I can see there that I'm going to have 37 3/4 inches. The actual garment will be 37 3/4 inches, which will give me 3 3/4 inches ease. And if I wanted to think about how that was going to fit and if I was happy with that, I could just put a tape measure around my body and set it at 37 3/4 inches just to see if I was happy with that. You'll also often find a bust point marking, which would be up round by your dart, at the end of your dart somewhere. This pattern hasn't actually got one of those. And you'll also find lengthen and shorten lines on most pattern pieces as well. If the garment is going to be too long or too short in the body for you, you cut along those lines, and then you can either overlap the pattern pieces or spread them if you need to make it longer. These don't need to be marked on your fabric when you're preparing your dressmaking fabric, but they can be really useful if you're making a practice run first and making a toile. You could mark them on there so that you could see if the waist was in the right position or if the bust point was in the right position, because you've also got your waist markings here as well, which are useful for you to bear in mind as well. So that's all of the main parts that you need to be looking out for on these pattern pieces. Obviously sometimes there will be little additional bits of detail. For example, on this one we've got pocket markings here. They're for sort of little design details, but any of those just need to be marked on the fabric, again with tailor's chalk or tailor tacks, just so that you know where to position things on your fabric. I hope you found that useful today. I really hope that it helps you on your sewing journey and gives you the confidence to get started. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we've got a huge range of sewing patterns on our website. You'll find the links to our website below. We also stock the most beautiful dressmaking fabrics and all the haberdashery and notions you could ever need for your project, so get on and have a look at those. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.